Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am a big fan of thinking philosophy together with things like martial arts, with physical activity, with the gymnasium that we all know from Socrates and Plato. And I think we've actually gotten in a lot of trouble in philosophy and thinking in general by separating the life of the mind from the arts of the body. And I love speaking with Drew. Drew does a lot in jiu-jitsu. I am fascinated by the work that he does. He sent me a book that he's been working on that was fascinating, and I am thrilled to have an opportunity to speak with him. Drew, it is good to see you. So what got you into jiu-jitsu, Drew? And thank you for being here today, sir.
How's it going, Daniel?
I'm
Thanks
doing
for having me. I just wanted to say shout out to you and your family and your wife. You guys put out really good content, and not just content, but you guys really embody the philosophic life and the life of the mind and the life of the body. So a lot from just a big shout out to you guys. As
well,
far as
thank you.
jujitsu, I started training when I was 15 years old. I'm 35 now, so I've been on the mat for 20 years, and there's just a lot of insights start coming to fruition when you study it so much, and the patterns really start to unveil for me. And it's just been a really good sharing of teaching. I've been teaching probably for close to 15 years. And it's just the parallels to philosophy. I studied philosophy in college, have a bachelor's degree in philosophy, and really in the last 3 4 years, I've taken a lot of online classes and really kind of doubled down on what was important for me, which was kind of the life of the mind and being a physical in a physical job. I do this for a living. Been running this academy for the last 7 years on my own. So it's been a really it's very intriguing for me to add the mind. I'll have plenty of time when my body is wearing out to really think about things and really dissect. And the parallels of philosophy just go so strong. I just so obvious to me that I look forward to developing my skill and abilities in philosophy, and meeting so many people through these online courses that I've taken has been the real treat. So yeah, I just hope to um, share and really I hope to get some philosophers training jujitsu. That's like probably my real call out. This is it is the it's such a playground for truth too. I think jujitsu is married with truth, different than most martial arts, including all the like striking arts. You can really get down to um, the truth of not knowing and being overwhelmed with the framework of what's around you, and having to go through the steps and the years and the time of of I wouldn't call it necessarily suffering, but struggle or suffering, where you end up having these just insights, not nonstop insights that help help you grow or help just make sense of the world. And it just, I think it bleeds off into I don't talk too much philosophy uh, on purpose, but it comes out, and the questions I get from students is very very philosophical.
Well, that was an excellent answer. A few things. My beloved friend Paul Chin, I'd never done jujitsu, so I wrestled for about 8 years. I did wushu for two, long distance running and different things, but I never did
That's awesome.
jujitsu. I really enjoyed it. We live on a farm and different things. And one of the things when Mr. Chen took me to do the jujitsu, because he's been doing it for a few years, I was so struck. Well, one, I looked like an idiot because I didn't know what I was doing, so that was fun. But two, it took me back to wrestling, which was great. But then I was, oh, wait a minute. Actually, in this sport, being on your back is better than being on your stomach. Got to get that out of my system. But what was so interesting to me about it, and I'd be curious how you respond to this, is how it really did feel like chess. It felt very methodical. It felt very like you're making very live decisions where every choice you make has a certain consequence and you have to really think ahead of what you're going to do. Where I would say in wrestling, like, for example, if you're going to do a switch, you really just need to be able to do it well and methodically. And yes, you do have a chain, but it was very interesting to me how much how much more like I guess the way I describe it is like chess. It felt on jiu-jitsu as opposed to other say like wrestling or even things like wushu or different things like that. Just as a quick question, I'd be curious your response to that impression that I have, if that's off, if that's grounded in something, etc.
Yeah, well, I think there's more options in jiu-jitsu, and I think there's also a definitive end to jiu-jitsu. And one of the difference in wrestling is kind of interesting is you're not it's set up in a situation where you can't give up. You're not allowed to give up. If you give up, you're not doing it right, and you're kind of missing the point of it. And I do think that develops a type of willpower that is powerful, but also has its constraints. Whereas jujitsu, you have to accept the moment of truth, or you're going to face the injuries, and even in jujitsu, and where you get to when you investigate is the sport is built around landing a submission, but that's not your only option. So you have these pieces moving, and you have the rook moving, not just a lineal way, and you get upside down and you get inverted, and there's still a symmetry there. There's still a board, and there still is an ability in jiu-jitsu where, like, unlike chess, you could just knock the pieces over and take the submission from it. You could take the takedown, just go hard. And I feel like wrestling is more of a oh, you're going to play that move, I can play that move harder than your move. So in jiu-jitsu, there is a more of, hey, you have to accept my movement and accept that it's not your turn to go, and let the position progress. And I think jiu-jitsu also, in the essence of it, and I think this is where I get to in the book, and this is the type of supplemental kind of talks that I don't think you can do really on the mat. We spend our time performing and practicing and doing. And I think it's important for students of jiu-jitsu to sit back and think in these type of ways, because you do need to realize that there are more options, and that really at the essence of jiu-jitsu is this effortlessness. And this, I think, I'm sure we'll get into the effortlessness of the flow state, of coming up with new things, and not just chasing new things, but accepting that there are these classic positions, or these general things that you can't ignore. And if you ignore them, you are not getting the most out of your capabilities, or you're just missing easy opportunities for success. And the jiu-jitsu artist can overcome a size and a weight and a strength advantage by understanding and having the abilities to manipulate the environment, or themselves in the environment. So I think with wrestling, there's more constraint on the rules, and one of the obvious ones being on your back. And I do get that into the book. Being on your back, you have different affordances. You have the ability to use your legs, and you also are in a situation where your opponent can't do the same things that you can do to your opponent. So as the person laying down, I can tip them over, I can go behind, and I can submit them. Well, if you investigate the nature of the top position, you can't tip them over. They're already tipped over. You can't go behind because their back is laying on the ground. If you attempt to submit them, you have to go through this intricate web of attacks with the legs and the arms. You have to do it with your arms, where your feet are on the ground, your knees are on the ground. When you're just using arms against two legs and two arms, it is a difficult challenge, and one that can be overcome, which is a lot of fun. And that's where the chess match, usually begins.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I discovered quite quick, it's like, oh, wait, they're on their back. This is with Paul, I was like, oh, the legs are quite something. So it's funny you mentioned that. I really like the point you were making about the definite end, this sense of a very definite end in jiu-jitsu, because that was something that really struck me about it. Where in wrestling you could win on points, you could win, with a pin and different things, and it's very open-ended and different things. But there's something very methodical about jiu-jitsu. Before I forget, I was also going to say congratulate. That's very noble to be working on something for so many years, so many decades that you've been working. And I really think basically, that sort of commitment to a craft that can get to the form where it's basically an art form, because when you do martial arts or jiu-jitsu, it becomes like an art. You know, the word art didn't just mean to mean painting or something you hang on a wall, but it was the highest form of skill. And I actually think that's one of the things where when humans commit to something and develop it over that many years, that's one of the keys to a fulfilling life. And one of the problems today is that we actually kind of have an experience drunk society, which is always do something new experience and whatever. Well, you never get roots. Now, if you have roots and don't go anywhere, then you don't go anywhere, so that's not good. But also, if you're always just going on to the next thing, it never becomes meaningful. And I think often when people talk about nihilism, meaning crisis, and different things, the roots problem, you know, the lack of roots, the lack of depth is important. You know, in life, a way to put it is, if you have distance but no depth, you're shallow. But if you have depth and no distance, you don't go anywhere. So you need to have both. And I think this age is one that's particularly susceptible to the mistake of distance that's shallow. And so that kind of commitment, and you really can't have a story if you don't have that kind of commitment. And humans need that kind of sense of a story in many ways. So I applaud you in that. But the notion of the definite end was so fascinating to me because I mentioned story. Story also brings with it a kind of definite end. Like once you get to the end, it feels like it could have gone no other way. And what's interesting is where jiu-jitsu, story, and philosophy kind of tend to go together in many ways, or kind of gymnastics, because of philosophy, when you make an argument, it needs to feel like that argument is justified. That had to be where the argument went, right? If a philosopher argues for something and you go, well, actually, I could see the alternative, then it's not a very good argument, right? Philosophy has to create this feeling of not necessarily closing you down to possibility, but it has to be definite. And in that definite, open you up to possibilities, but there has to be a kind of definite feeling to it. Well, jiu-jitsu also had this definite feeling to it. And a good story also feels like it couldn't have gone any other way, or going another way would have not been satisfactory. There's a certain definiteness to it. And I think those three are pretty interesting to me, because human beings don't seem to do very well if they don't have any philosophical ability, if their life doesn't feel like it has any structure or story to it, and if they feel like they're not able to use their body very well. So those kind of three things go together. And it really, I'd be curious how you respond to this. Maybe I'm crazy, but like I also really felt like the jiu-jitsu, it felt like the building of a narrative, a building of a story. And a good story has a kind of philosophical discernment to it as well, right? Because you have to think about the motives of the characters. You have to think about the situation. So it was interesting as me, because the other thing Michelle and I do so much in is fiction writing. We do so much in creative writing and different things. And a good story has this kind of movement toward a definite end, a discernment of how best to get there, a kind of clarity of vision that leads to this sort of building to one another. So I'd be curious, any impressions to that?
Totally, yes. I think, you know, I think jujitsu is a very extreme parallel to poetry and literature, where you are defining things, and not just the end of the match, the end of the situation, but you are pointing at two other truths, like say you are using too much willpower, and you know the move, but you're too wrapped up in the moment of this, wanting to win and wanting to have this desire, and you have to tame that and to let the position progress to give yourself another opportunity for attack. There's no way. What's cool about, well, so jiu-jitsu, the I would say the essence of jiu-jitsu is a smaller, weaker, slower person beating somebody who's bigger, faster, stronger. So overcoming that hurdle requires something besides just willpower or strength or any one of those individual things. And there may be little examples of where strength gets you out of the situation, but you didn't necessarily use jiu-jitsu. Despite the fact you did know jiu-jitsu, you survived. And I think I think we're in a situation where, like, that always that is dangerous to get kind of a false positive. And what's kind of cool about jiu-jitsu is there is this really very important self-awareness. And I think the nature of jiu-jitsu as being a human versus human altercation, and this looking at someone else, looking at yourself, kind of metaphor really is most of the time it's you, not the other person. And like getting into that mode of being um, where you can adjust to the environment is, I think, is really important. And as far as it playing out like a story, it takes time to develop these techniques, and you are really trying to put things together in a way where it works out in the end. You're not always, I mean, what's cool about jiu-jitsu is you're in the present, you have to dealing with what's coming at you, but you're also putting the flame on the fire. You're also, the way that you approach your attack sets off your opponent's defense or his offense, or it sets off the way that they come at you, and everybody has a different style of how they're going to tell the story. You could be a quick and fast and hard, and still be very smooth and delicate, or you could go slow and strong and really methodical. And my personal style is to mix everything together and to really be somebody who's good in sleight of hand. I think of jiu-jitsu, I think chess is a very good analogy for jiu-jitsu, but I think it goes, I think people don't, I think it's a little bit more of sleight of hand than chess. It's you tell the person you're going to steal their wallet, and then you take their watch, and there's this playful yet threatening, and that's what I really try to tune in when I'm training in my casual rolling and sparring. And what's cool about jiu-jitsu is you can put it to the test. You can go compete against somebody your level, and I think that's kind of the stuff I would see too with philosophy is, you take two black belts and you see them go against each other, but sometimes, hey, it's a stalemate and nothing really happens and it's kind of boring. And that's what I like too, is with and with conversation with people with a little bit higher experience in philosophy than me, is when I'm in jiu-jitsu, I can take a lower rank into deeper waters, and they can experience what I'm teaching them. They can experience going through the options and not forcing your way through. Whereas same in these philosophic conversations and a lot of your videos and a lot of the people that I've met that make videos online and make content, that you can follow along in such a way that's even it's just as important as reading the foundational text, because it's just putting you in the situation for success so much. Instead of, that's what I appreciate about you and a lot of people that I've met, is similar to Aristotle, where you're going to try to think of the most important, the essence of the position, and try to explain, instead of just taking a snapshot and explaining every single little detail. I think there's like a over content vibe on the internet right now, but there's still like a lot of room for something like the four causes of relational equation, where you could ask yourselves, anybody could have a conversation with that relational equation and really start to come to some deep truths. So that's I see jiu-jitsu as more of in that kind of light.
That's an excellent answer. Well, first, a few things. First off, thank you for all that. Second, I do I appreciate what you were saying about sleight of hand, because I often think about card tricks. I always love card tricks. And there's something about good art, good philosophy that has a kind of card trick structure, where something emerges that's surprising, but then once it occurs, it's like, oh, it had to have occurred this way, of course. And there's this kind of like, there's something very methodical in the card trick that then is all behind the scenes, though, because if they see you doing the mechanical thing, they know how you're doing the trick. Right. So there's this kind of invisibility that creates the magic, that creates the effect. So I appreciate that. The other thing that's very interesting to me is there's this long history of people kind of scratching their head and trying to figure out the relationship between, say, philosophy and literature, philosophy and art, and and so on and so forth. I sometimes wonder if you need to go through gymnastics or say jiu-jitsu to make that connection, that's kind of the missing third that you need to see how they go together, because all three of them seem to be dealing with a situation that requires mental activity to kind of figure out. So for example, the philosopher is saying, I am in a world where it seems like there are things called human beings. What is the human being? So you find yourself confronted with a situation and now you need to think through it, right? And there's really no set laws. Like you can't like know necessarily just by looking somewhere the best way to go about that question. And yet it's not relative. It's not just open. There are rights and wrongs, but the rights and the are live with the situation. And you have to be a very active thinker to figure out the best way to go about that. So it goes in jiu-jitsu or wrestling. There are definitely better moves or worse moves to make, but you can't know what they're going to be until the match begins, until you're live in it. Well, likewise, in fiction writing, it seems as if the characters could do anything. It seems like the story could be anything, but actually, no. There are very, very clear principles that make a good story and not, but you can't know them unless you're in it and you're doing it. And yet, if you're someone on the outside, it looks like it's all random. It looks like it could have gone anything, but no, there's actually a logic that there's a truth and a logic that can only be known in it. And something that's very interesting about all three of those is that they entail a truth that is inseparable from the doing. There is a truth that is inseparable from the situation. And I think that's very important. Now, look, you could take, this isn't to say it's better than, say, science, but science, the whole glory of science is that it's not situational, that you could run the same experiment. There are certain conditions, yes, but you don't need certain people at certain skill levels. Basically, the glory of science is that, and this is how Jonathan Rauch put it, is that anyone who is in the laboratory would have seen the same results. It's not contingent upon the person and their imagination and their thinking. It's the same results. That's the glory of it. The glory of mathematics is the same thing. But the glory of these kind of these philosophical works or these more abstract thoughts is that you have to be in the situation to do it. And the person who is writing the story or who is on the mat or is trying to look into philosophical questions, they themselves become the linchpin, if you give me that term, between the abstract and the concrete. Like this is the key. Philosophy is at its best when it's trying to arrive at concrete situations to better interpret them and understand them. Likewise, the artist who's making like a story is at their best when they take their ideas of the story and make it very clear for the reader. So, for example, what they'll say often is that the best stories are the ones that the words are invisible on the page. Like there's no stopping. You just kind of flow with it. You forget you're reading a book. The moment the reader remembers they're reading, the story has messed up or the sentence is bad. There's a grammar mess up, right? The whole idea of doing it well is to make you forget that you're even reading, right? Likewise, the beauty when philosophy is at its best, people actually forget they're doing philosophy. They're just caught up in the wonder of the question, right? So likewise, as you know on the mat, like when you're doing it really well, you're not thinking too much. You're thinking enough to keep in the flow, but not so much that you become the centipede that you're frozen and you don't know what to do. So you have to engage in this sort of mastery to where the line between abstract thought and concrete thought goes away. Like it becomes invisible, the subject-object divide goes away. It's been conditioned. I like to talk about conditionalism simply because it's the middle ground between like going to the gym to condition, but then setting the conditions of the flow state, which requires philosophy and so on to do. And basically, it would seem as if the human being is really optimal when they see life as something that they need to be conditioned to condition well so that they can be lost in the flow of activity with it. Likewise, the artist works really hard so when they go to write the story, it just flows out of them naturally and it looks like it doesn't take a lot of effort precisely because they put in so much effort that it kind of just flows. Likewise, the philosopher has done enough abstract reasoning to where when they pursue the question, like they're after Socrates, to use that phrase from Vervaeke, they're just after it. They're not thinking about, oh, we're doing philosophy. The moment you remember you're doing philosophy, that's probably precisely when you stop doing philosophy. It's supposed to carry you away. And likewise, great athletic achievement has this sort of like, I don't want to say thoughtlessness. It's a kind of thoughtlessness or auto mastery. That's the term, auto mastery. And it would seem as if we need to think all three of those to see how they go together. And I think sometimes I'd be curious how you respond to it. Is that it's like we've tried to think philosophy and the arts together. Some people have. And it's harder to do that if you can't have the middle piece, if you will, of gymnastics in the body to see how those three have special overlap that then makes us see how the human being is a conditioning entity. We're a conditioning being that creates our conditions that then condition us back, and the subject-object divide goes away, and that the name of the game is to frankly make the subject-object divide go away by training our bodies to where there's no task that we encounter that we can't work with, to train our minds so that there's no problem that we can't flow with, and to also train our creativity to where we're able to create without getting stuck. There's some sort of like trying to condition ourselves so that in all areas of life we're able to maintain that self-forgetfulness, that flow, that kind of going with things, that collapse of the subject-object divide. I'd be curious if anything comes up for you on that.
Well, first, I think you did a really amazing job of articulating that, and that's what's like so useful to me to hang around philosophers, to hang out with philosophers, and to be in this situation, because that's kind of how I try to have been living my life for the last 20 years. I read Plato's Republic in high school, and just and have always had a book in my back pocket and some philosophy that is guiding me and trying to get on that wavelength, and um, including with the business, including with the relationships that I have with people. So I would say like that's what's kind of interesting, where I'm going in the reverse, where I feel like I can perform these things. I mean, and it's not something I could do instantly, but I feel like I can have a conversation with just about anybody. If you can get in a fight with somebody, you can have a conversation with somebody. It's not so easy of a metaphor there. I think it's harder for some. I know really tough guys in here that can fight, but they can't have a conversation. And really what's I think special about jiu-jitsu, and I think like any other sport, jiu-jitsu is something actually more special. Like Aristotle talks about the tragedy being the best form of play because of the attributes that it has. I think jiu-jitsu has this same attribute for martial arts or physical activity. It really is so potent in what it brings. I mean, you have to do it with another person. You have to do it in the middle of a community, and we don't have any rules written on the walls. This is like you follow how everybody else is doing. This is not something that you can go find your way through and exploit manually or scientifically. You have to learn how to fit in. And tell you, we're really cool and laid back, and people leave here. It's like, wow, it's like a family. And that, I mean, really, people are here more than they are with their family, really. And people hang out for hours after we close, and this and you've talked about before, and it really was um it really gave me a huge insight in pointing these things out. Was you had a video about risk, relevance, and ritual, and jiu-jitsu is just, I mean, it like one of the things like it's hard to explain because it's so obvious, and I think you did a really good job. I think everyone should watch that video for jiu-jitsu, and I really would like to find and maybe even just curate a playlist for grapplers. This is something that they're missing. I think jiu-jitsu has grown as a sport and as a skill that the techniques are obvious, the game theory and strategy should be obvious, but you need the philosopher to explain what the human is, and it changes and evolves, and we remember some of the most important things. I'm into the classics as well. I'm into literature. I mean, this I think is important for remembering the obvious yet hidden things that really can give you a boost, and especially when things are not going well too. Some easy opening, some easy horizon to take advantage of is really going to like have more effect than optimizing some special thing that you can only use in this specific scenario works every time and only in this very rare specific scenario. And so I mean that, yeah, that's about it.
Well, that's going to, it makes me think of, so it's very interesting because, in the West, we tend to talk about subjectivity and objectivity, the subject-object divide. But what's very interesting is, like, we'll talk about some of the Japanese philosophers, and I'll bring in praise of shadows, particularly. A shadow is very interesting because a shadow only appears under a certain condition. You have to have the light here, you have to have an object here blocking the light, and now there's a shadow. This is what we call conditionalism. Like, there are certain experiences in reality, there are certain ways reality unfolds only under certain conditions. And those aren't captured by the subject-object divide, really. The other example is a rainbow from Owen Barfield, which he's a tremendous thinker. And, to see a rainbow, you have to stand in a particular place, and there has to be rain and light, and there's a particular condition that has to be met in order to experience the rainbow. And literally, the very way we apprehend reality, the very way that reality is disclosed to us, and the very way that we are able to think and to feel and to be is conditioned. It's not merely, like, the mistake is thinking that my experience of the object is not somehow conditioned by the object, and that the object is not somehow conditioned by the subject. Because basically what Owen Barfield asks, he's like, what if everything is like a rainbow? Not just rainbows, but trees, but relationships and everything. What if, and the argument we try to make is, what if the person is like a rainbow? It's only under certain conditions that the fullness of the human being comes out. Now, we're all human in a sense. I'm not saying we're not person, but the full humanity seems to require a certain conditioning, in the same way that there are certain conditions that have to be met in order to experience a rainbow. And another reason, like I mentioned, we talk about the word conditioning, is because conditioning is a physical term. I'm going to go condition, lift weights. I'm going to go on the mat. Then there's the conditioning the room so that there are shadows, to have the certain effect. And then there is the idea that reality can be conditioned to disclose itself in different ways. And the way that it discloses itself impacts myself as a human being in it. The reason why I think this is all very, very important is because it seems as if the fullness of the human being comes out when we learn to condition ourselves in a manner that is able to more so eradicate the subject-object divide than more so to enter a flow state. And if I were to give a very general schema that I'd have to think about, so you have mind, body, and maybe heart, we could say. Now, I know these are not separate, but I'm just, making a model here. It's like philosophy is at best when it conditions the mind to forget itself. The body is at its best when it's conditioned to the place where it can go on the mat and forget itself. And the heart is at its best when it's conditioned to the place where it's able to feel and to not be taken over by its feelings, but to actually kind of work with them, right? And so if mind is philosophy, body is gymnasium, and say heart is art, then all three of them are at the best when we condition all three of them to engage in this kind of forgetfulness of them, this kind of flow of all of them, of which then, funny enough, is then when all three of them flow into one another. If you can learn to be a conversationalist and, do philosophy, if you can learn also to be on the mat, and if you can also be creative, then your entire life gets a certain flow to it, because there's no area of life you can go into that has you bump up against something and thus makes you remember the subject-object divide. And that's why it seems like the philosopher needs to also train their body, because they may be able to go in the classroom and make the subject-object divide go away. But then when they go and they have to fix the tire on the car and they can't do it, there's a divide between me and the car because I can't fix it. And then when they go into relationships and they don't know how to talk with people because they haven't worked on their heart and they don't have emotional intelligence, subject-object divide comes back because I don't know how to talk with this person. And it seems like the reason why these three have something to do with one another is because all of them are the fields in which we learn how to condition ourselves to maintain a flow state. And then if we can do all three of them, then in all areas of life, we can maintain a flow state, not just the contained sectors of it. And so then mind, body, heart all have different rituals, different training grounds to maintain the flow. And then if you can do all three, then all three flows. And now we have a full human being. Now we've met the condition of the rainbow. We've met the condition to see the rainbow. Now we've met the condition to see the full human being. But it requires conditioning in those areas to make the subject-object divide go away. And then you have something more like a dance, right? Life has more of that dance Dante principle. I'd be curious if anything comes up for you.
Yeah, a few things. I mean, again, with jujitsu as being like a very potent art, if you can, and that's what I have in mind for the book, is to initiate people properly into the art. I think there is a lot of different ways that you can get into it, and that can have an effect on what you get out of it, and where you start, and where you engage, and what the community and what the environment is like. It's going to have a huge impact. That may seem small, but it eventually going to put you in a situation where you're going to have to backtrack and unlearn, and which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's part of the story of your jujitsu journey. And being an always beginner mindset is something that's necessary in jujitsu. Like everything, what's cool about jujitsu, the necessity provides you, the necessity uh, provides all the reasons to change, and the reasons to have insights and change your mind and try a different option, or try a different way of being. And the if you can overcome obstacles that you didn't think, where most people cannot overcome, and you get to that true humanity of this overcoming things that seem unovercomable, but are, if you look back in like some of the classics, if this would be like a common theme, or something that's so common that's not even talked about, that's just hidden in plain sight. And I think too, for jujitsu, there is the mind, body, and heart involved in it. And I think that, like we were talking, I was mentioning that once you get to a level where you understand the techniques, and you understand what your opponent is trying to throw at you, you there's nothing left but to investigate yourself and investigate your opponent. And are you being readable? Are you like, there's, even if you are still, the longer you are practicing, the longer it's going to take to have an insight too. The longer you have to grind and dig for something that's like useful. And it's not going to be a new technology, a new technique. It's going to be something, you're looking for something that's obvious yet hidden. And this is kind of what I want to make sure I do with my students is, and this is what I think people need to, or we're going to lose the art of jiu-jitsu is having a really nice growth spurt, and there's more popularity. And really, just like anything growing in popularity, the strategy for it growing is really not good for the essence of the art. By exploiting the most viral things, it's just not going to, or exploiting the most marketable things. What if you come to jiu-jitsu to with just an open, I think the best way to come to jiu-jitsu is having kind of an open mind. The best is like, oh, I was living down the street, and then this sign popped up, and I went in, having no like just kind of having and that's how I started jiu-jitsu. I had a sense of duty, and I always like, I'm not even going to try to define why I'm doing it. Now, maybe I learned how to play guitar to get a girlfriend, but jiu-jitsu, no. I like that example of, hey, you could learn to do something because of another reason. But if you come to it with an open mind, and you can just sense the power of it when you first learn it, and that you don't want to like try to exploit it, or it will end up bad. And I think, as somebody who's running an academy, I'm always balancing this what is good for the students and what's good for the business, and being in that equilibrium I think is important too. You have to be in a flow state to run the business. There's new things. Hey, there's a leak in the ceiling, the air conditioner is out, and you could go try to will your way to fix things, and it's not going to work. You have to be calm and not be emotional, and tune into everything that you've learned, not just on the mat but even off the mat. I mean, it is a special place where after training you're straight in a conversation. People are like fully kind of, their body and mind is defragged and they're ready to, like, share. So I think that's my thoughts on it.
Well, that was all extremely good, and I'm glad you brought up business because, in the same way that we were talking about like philosophy, art, and gymnastics, I kind of often think of business as something philosophers should be forced to do, or their thinking's bad. In the same way that artists should be forced to do business, and business people should be forced to do art and philosophy. And this is kind of the trick, because there's something about business that has that concretion, that making concrete, just like does the math, right? And that's so important. I was also going to comment on that tension between growth and essence. That's really big, because like you have to figure out how to make something, but you're only going to face the tension between growth and essence if you do what? The business side. If you go into the business and you're like, how do I make this sustainable without killing it? Because if I make sustainable a dead thing, then I failed, right? Well, that very tension is a tension that the philosopher, if you will, probably will never have to think if they just have tenure at a university. That's why, because you were also mentioning making sure that in jiu-jitsu you keep the heart and the philosophy into jiu-jitsu, but as it grows, it becomes easier to push that out for the sake of growth, and how that becomes poisonous to it. Well, that happens to philosophy as well. In intellectualism, it gets into the university and it grows and it becomes more powerful, but then it kicks out the common life, as David Hume talked about. It kicks out the creative to become analytical and more authoritative, and then it dies. Well, likewise, art does the same thing. If art removes the philosophical in the name of expression, or business is evil, we're not going to think that, then art becomes propaganda. And what's very interesting is that the heart, so it's this weird thing where you need to be able to learn flow. I'll use the language of flow. You must learn flow in mind, you must learn flow in body, and you must learn flow in heart. And then you have to bring heart into body and mind, and you have to bring all three levels of the stack into all other levels of the stack in order so that they are full. And then to keep them together, you have to be able to have the flow in all of them. So there's like this, all three of those are things you have to be able to do, because otherwise you can't bring them together, and then you can't keep them in their fullness if they're not together. If you say are able to bring heart and mind together, but not body, the fullness is not there, and it's probably only a matter of time before actually heart and mind get in conflict, because the, say, reel of bills is going to sew up the business, the reel of having to sustain something, and now they're pulled apart. You were able to keep heart and mind together when you didn't have to worry about business, but now that you got to pay bills, they fly apart. So you've got to be able to do all three, because otherwise you're not going to be able to hold them together, thus meet the condition of the rainbow, Owen Barfield, thus meeting the condition of the full human being. So you have to be able to hold all three together. And basically what ends up happening is, via specialization or whatever, philosophy is over here in the university, jiu-jitsu is over there for people who aren't interested in thinking, and art is over here for the emotive type. And all three of them then corrode as a consequence. And what's really key is that bringing all three together is what makes life feel more playful. It increases the feeling of play in life. And you were mentioning staying after the jiu-jitsu. Like, there's a big problem today of the death of friendship. People will talk about the friend session, the loss of communal capital, community, and all these things. To the degree the human race is able to engage in play is to the degree there is friendship and community. And to the degree there's play is to the degree we can hold all those three things together. And so it is not by chance that you have this degradation of relationship where you don't have a society that's able to hold those three things together, because, well, that would require a lot of conditioning. And it always struck me, at the end of The Closing the American Mind by Alan Bloom, he basically said that without the humanities and the arts, there couldn't be friendship. That like philosophy, what he calls philosophy as a catch term, this kind of engagement, like this is the prerequisite for friendship. Especially in a first world nation that doesn't have friendship on the collective needing to build a barn. Like you could get a depth when we had to say get clean water together because there's a certain pilgrimage we had to go on, and we then like had, you know, we shared bruises together. But as you move to a first world nation and your facticity is not going to necessarily force upon you certain challenges of say getting the hay up with your bare hands or whatever, then you have to create new kinds of journeys together intentionally. And that means you have to intentionally go into philosophy, creativity, gymnasium, because if you don't, your very facticity will not necessarily give it to you. And then you're not going to actually condition yourself for the play, for the friendship, and for those deeper relationships. What people are now trying to do is their friends are the people they work with, that they go to work with, and, you know, like the co-workers in the office. This can work, but it seems like the danger of it is since the grounds of that relationship is I have to pay bills. I'm not choosing to be here. These are the people I happen to run into because I have to pay bills. That doesn't mean you're enemies, but without the full conditioning of full personhood that comes out in play, these relationships tend not to necessarily go to a certain depth. And I don't say that judgmentally. I think the research shows that where most retired people are lonely, most people they work with, they don't really talk to anymore, not because they dislike them, but because there's not a common play, a common interest, a common conditioning to bring them together. So we really can't have friendship, community, all of these things without these conditioning on all three of those levels. And then for me, and I'll give it back to you, I'd be curious what you say, is that a lot of the talk on nihilism and meaning crisis and all that is what happens when you don't have friendship, is what happens when you have a world of people that don't have deep friendships. But friendship, just like Cicero talks about, friendship is not merely a, I want to be your friend. No, in the same way, you can't merely say, I want to win the jiu-jitsu match. You can want that all day, but if you don't meet the condition, it's not going to happen, right? You can want to write a novel all day, but if you don't meet the condition of the skill, you can't do it. Friendship is an art. Friendship is something that requires certain conditioning to have. Depth of relationship is not something you can just want. It's something you have to rise yourself to the occasion of. And these three fields are the training precisely to have that depth of relationship and friendship. So I don't think it's by chance that you have people staying after jiu-jitsu. You have these people staying in these communities. Others' life, like with Justin or with Cadell, like these things you see is the resurgence of friendship that is only possible through the conditioning of the full human person in these three areas that then bring them together with the training to hold them together so you can have that deep community. I'd be curious what comes up for you.
Yeah, I mean, again, you just really put a gem on what is so special about jiu-jitsu, other than different than working out or doing things to get in shape and this and that, and actually because yeah, it's such a social lubricant of jiu-jitsu, this after you have accepted your status of development in jiu-jitsu. That's what's kind of cool. We have doctors, lawyers, dentists, kid who works at the car wash, you know, just everybody, different ages too, you know, it keeps you young, it makes you feel old. It's, I mean, just a really high level. You have to kind of be in a flow state just to say what's up to everybody, you know, to remember the names and to remember. It's just a really, really a special place. And I think, again, it's something that is not articulated enough for people to find a good academy, a good dojo. And the incentives are, I mean, there's people who are, you know, it's a land grab. Who's going to open up the next gym down the road, down in the new suburb? And it can be exploited. It will be, and it's already has been. And there's places where you could, you know, really love jiu-jitsu. And I think anywhere you do it, you're going to feel this. You're going to get something out of it, no matter who teaches you. That's kind of the danger, and that is how potent it is. That like you're being revealed something that is hidden to most people, and it is obvious. You know, it is your body. You're sitting, standing, kneeling, and laying. And what jiu-jitsu does is really outlines what you do when you're laying and kneeling and sitting. Shows you how to move and develop abilities and skills. And somebody could teach you that but they could be aligned very wrong compared to somebody who was conditioned by philosophy instead of conditioned by some type of greed or gain or progress, even just optimization. You could optimize in the wrong way very quick. And similarly to your jiu-jitsu game, you could optimize to a situation where you injure yourself. You know, this happens plenty. So I think that's really a great gym. You explained really what makes jiu-jitsu a jiu-jitsu academy such a special place relative to where you work or where you're going to work out or things like that. As far as the yeah, and it also does, right? It offers that I think what's cool about jiu-jitsu too is the self-defense aspect. This is how you defend yourself, and there's different ways to defend yourself. Back to jiu-jitsu as being a special martial art compared to other martial arts. What's cool about jiu-jitsu is there's no rules to it. Jiu-jitsu really became famous too with the start of the UFC and the ultimate fighting, the mixed martial arts. Jiu-jitsu is one art that can encompass all arts, and it's much more broad and has much more depth than, say, the striking arts, simply in the fact of options that you have to strike on your feet. We can strike on the ground. I train MMA fighters, mixed martial arts fighters. I had a couple, 3 amateur fighters this year. It's very interesting to see that play out. And it's very, I think jiu-jitsu has this special ability to really provide more depth and more depth than most martial arts.
Excellent answer. And, you know, it's funny when you were speaking, I know you were reading Marshall McLuhan, and is obviously his favorite, famous idea that the medium is the message. Well, the body is the thought. Like, the way you think is absolutely conditioned on your body. And one of the things that has killed philosophy is most of the philosophers are sitting at a desk in an office and thinking from there. And the body is the thought. So the very thoughts that they have are conditioned by the way they use their body. And so no wonder there's a subject-object divide. They're just a subject that's not interacting with freaking objects. And so there's a subject-object divide. Where if the philosopher is well aware that the body is the thought, then they may go think, maybe they'll sit at a desk, but later they'll go use a hammer, later they'll go be on the farm, later they'll do jiu-jitsu, and think in all of those situations and see the change in the quality of the thought. Likewise, thought changes the body. So you do jiu-jitsu thinking philosophically, then you do jiu-jitsu not thinking philosophically. You see the difference in quality. You bring different modes of activity, and you see how they inform one another. So I think we need, like, to bring that McLuhan notion, is to think about the body as the medium, and that the thought is, you know, that there's a connection. The body is the thought, if you will. The way that the body is conditions the thought, and we've separated those, and that's been a big problem. But likewise, we've separated thought from the body, so we're not bringing philosophy to the gym, and that's risking the exploitation, as you were saying, where it's just the act. And it doesn't matter how you think about it. Jiu-jitsu is jiu-jitsu. It doesn't matter. No, there's a way in which it loses its soul. And that's a major problem, because, you know, you mentioned the self-defense. I think it is so critical, and from my beloved David Hume, philosophy is primarily in the business of self-defense. Like, someone's coming in, trying to convince you to change your way of life, or trying to manipulate you, and you're able to defend yourself. You're also able to own your way of understanding reality. Like, separating philosophy from self-defense, from the ability to defend, you know, I think I mentioned to you before, like, a way I think about it, like the four main tiers of philosophy. And I like in your book as well, like, you have grip, frame, and hang and technique, and the different sections and different things. And like, a way I think about philosophy, one, wonder. being struck by being in the kind of Socrates or even Heideggerian way. Then there's the clearing, definitely Heideggerian. Let me clear aside all the dynamics or assumptions of reality to make space, clear aside language even. And then we'll see how being discloses itself, because as you know, the later Heidegger emphasizes this kind of clearing notion. Then I'm going to defend my clearing from anyone who tries to fill it with dynamics. And I'm also going to have that Martin Buber waiting in it for what may come up, right? I'm going to continue my flow state, and I'm going to occupy this clearing that I'm defending so that life can disclose itself in a new way, which requires me to be able to defend my clearing so that I can do it. That conception of philosophy, which I think brings together the heart, mind, and body, is a conception of philosophy that I think is very difficult for philosophers to think that are sitting at their desk all day, because the body is the thought, right? And that mode of philosophy is, for me, the legacy of the counter-enlightenment, the modern counter-enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment. You have thinkers like Michel Planier, who was an utter genius, who wrote a book called Personal Knowledge, Tactile Knowledge, the inevitable connection between thought and body in different ways. He's a tremendous man. Marcis Blondel, on where he talks about when philosophy is separated from action, you can't think metaphysics. I can keep Benjamin Fonda, I can keep going. There are all these philosophers who are basically screaming. Well, honestly, they were screaming that if you make this mistake, you end up in totalitarianism. You end up in a world where there's one rationality that the people in power decide, and everyone gets forced into it. Oh, and everyone's been disabled from the capacity to defend themselves from that, precisely because they haven't been taught philosophy as self-defense. So the stakes are very high. Like in the way that you're talking about the risk of jiu-jitsu when it loses the heart, becoming just a business enterprise and it dies. Well, likewise, when philosophy loses it, then people lose the capacity to not be manipulated and to not be kind of pulled into totalitarian structures or ideology or different things. So there are very, very, very real stakes in not getting this stuff right. And if we don't get it right, well, then we may not even have the ability to realize we're not getting it right, because that would require thinking. That's really also the horror of this. Like, if you think bad thoughts, then you don't have the capacity to know you think bad thoughts. And so right, you get entrapped in that. Likewise, if you don't realize that the body is the thought, I keep using that expression now, but if you don't realize that, then you won't know that your thinking is impacted by the fact you've never done jiu-jitsu, or that you've never done wrestling, or that you've never run a business, or that you've never tried to figure out how to make all those things work together. You'll think your thinking is actually better because you're sitting in an office and never going outside. Because look at all these brilliant thoughts I'm having when I'm sitting in here. Yes, but the only reason you think that is because you don't leave the office. And this would show where choice matters. If you choose never to leave the office, then you can't even realize what you're missing out because you never leave the office. If you choose never to get on the mat, then you never experience the world as conditioned differently than how you always condition it to realize you're missing out on something. So the stakes are very, very high. And unfortunately, we don't necessarily have a school system, as Ivan Illich talks about, that teaches people that the stakes are very, very high. And so, and then I'll give it back to you, just curious what you think, is that if you don't realize that this kind of ablement that we're talking about in all three areas allows you to have like deep friendship, well, then you've never had the experience of deep friendship to know what you're missing out on. Like, that's also the terror of this. Like, if you've never had the experience of that deep community you're talking about, then you can't tell the difference between associates, Facebook friends, and friends. And so you lose the even ability to know there's some alternative to life, actually. And that's why the stakes are so high. And for me, good teachers, good guides, people like you, like good teachers are the ones that make people realize there are all alternatives to life. That's a key thing. Like, teachers now, we view them as their job is to give us information. But you see, I can give you information all day and not introduce you to a new alternative. Makes me think of McGillicuddy awareness, Ivan Illich awareness. Like a good teacher gives you an awareness that there are other ways. And if we only think teachers are in the business of giving you information about a discipline, then they don't give you an alternative vision of life. And you see, but then it becomes like a systematic mistake, because if those teachers were taught by people who never left the office, then they don't know there's an alternative, and then it trickles down. So what I hope is that we're entering a world of people where that legacy of trickle down, that kind of legacy of trickle down entrapment is being corrected, precisely because you have now people like you who are doing philosophy while running a dojo, people who are doing martial arts and bringing them together, and who are living in different life conditions and life situations according to different rituals, et cetera, so forth, that they would stop this legacy of trickle down entrapment and disablement that's been going on, because we need to be aware that there are alternative ways to live. If we do not learn that, then it's questionable if we've learned anything at all.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And you brought up McLuhan, and McLuhan really just kind of fascinated me. He was really good at his process of speaking and talking, and his he really brought me into literature. He's kind of the philosopher, or kind of a thinker, who brings you to go read the Greeks, brings you to go read the classics, brings you to, and that's kind of what's cool about philosophy too, as well. It's kind of, it brings you to what you should study next, or what should inform next. And really, I think that is what is at the essence of jiu-jitsu, is training perception, not training learning techniques and having a new technique. It is training perception. And with McLuhan, I think he does a really good job of pointing out the difference between tactile sense and visual sense. And I think jiu-jitsu has this tactile learning, and I do think there's a different type of learning required for doing than just in GPTing all the information. I mean, that faculty is kind of an out of necessity, is not as useful anymore. And it was kind of interesting seeing that play out right now. And I think jiu-jitsu really is the way that one should be initiated into it is. And I think the most powerful, I think the philosophy self-defense is as powerful as the physical self-defense. I think it's more power. I mean, I think people learn, I think you're going to get more out of that than the self-defense. You can't do it for 20 years. I could defend myself. You could learn how to defend yourselves in a couple of years, but the perception that you're going to gain by trying to not even improve, but just I'm trying to think of the way, like I said, I'm so busy doing, so you throw the business on top, throw the family, throw a kids, it's you have to accept the challenge. You have to accept what your limitations. So it's really it forces you. I think if you are investigating it properly, if you're on the right path to learning, you're going to run into the similar scenarios, and there is a pattern recognition. And dealing, and McLuhan also, I've taken a lot from him, dealing with the simultaneous environment of jiu-jitsu, and having the perception to feel the wind and not see it. I think that's what, there's a lot of cool, with songwriting and literature, the metaphors of wind, and using metaphors in learning really is, I think, where the juice is at, especially with the environment where knowledge is so accessible. But back to what was I saying with McLuhan and perception, and oh yeah, we live in a simultaneous environment right now. My phone's going off. Yeah, I'm being conditioned by so many things, and jiu-jitsu is an entering into a place that's free from the fake pressures of reality, the things that do not really affect you, all the office politics and all the things that really you have an answer for. And there's like this weird feeling of doing jiu-jitsu, and you go into the gym or the dojo, and you're not sure about what you're going to say or do in this situation that you have building up, and then you leave the gym, you go, I know exactly what to do, I know exactly what to say. I mean, it's just like a really good defrag of your brain and your heart and your mind. Really, it's a cool kind of experience. I do think there's something special, and I think McLuhan does point to and I think we're going back into a more tactile out of necessity to get back to the real, get them back to. There's a lot of memes, the touch grass and these kind of things. But what I think they are pointing, I think jujitsu has a remedy for this. I think it's part of an ecology of practices to add to your skill stack, right? I think jujitsu really, to do jujitsu well, I don't think you can really I don't think you can do jujitsu well without having philosophy or having game theory, having business knowledge. I think, being I don't it's not that many people do it either too. It's still a very rare to be able to perform at the high level. And I would consider, there are two different things. Knowing how to disclose and explain and teach are different than being able to perform it. And there's some really good teachers who can teach, but they're not as good at performing. I mean, age is an obvious example, but I also think that you can do both. I think that if you could get the people who are really tuned in to, I think there's a lot of jiu-jitsu athletes who they want to they don't really have a direction to go. I think there's a couple different categories of grapplers. There's the Dagestani wrestlers and they're very popular in the mixed martial arts. They've taken over the mixed martial arts world. You want to win a mixed martial arts fight, you close the distance, take them down, and ground and pound. Right. They turn their back, you take their back. And the way that they train is that they have their risk and ritual down and relevance down. They follow a very, strict Muslim religion, and they take naps in the afternoon, and they really, have a easy path where they don't have to think about, and everything's, if they just follow that route, it's going to be, for the most part, there's not going to be any distractions to get for your goals. Whereas, the jiu-jitsu artist is the modern jiu-jitsu artist is kind of this, 15-year-old kid who plays video games all day and trains jiu-jitsu all day and is super limber and flexible and, has really, and I do think they do have a attunement to the spin of the earth more than most people, but it really goes, really a lot of wasted opportunity of growth by not kind of tuning into this kind of more based, more classics, more philosophical type of life, that will just provide so much more fruit than if you're conditioned to it from your environment, like from your cell phone, from your follower count, there's just so many that you have to know that there's these obvious yet hidden things influencing you, and that you're on this autopilot default mode programming. It's like you can't really tune into your flow state in jiu-jitsu until you've really mastered it, because if you're running your default patterns, you're readable. They're getting a read on you, and you can do all the moves correctly and be right, but like that, again, this was cool, it's a two-player game. If you're too readable, then they're going to get you, and that's just like in business or in your normal everyday life and relationships. Like, you don't really want to be on autopilot. You want to be in the flow state, and then back to, I'm not sure what state you think, maybe you can articulate that. I'm sure you can articulate better that state where, and I think you were getting to it too. I think I've heard you speak of it. It would say, you not the flow state, but the preparation, the process of it arising and occurring. You obviously can't force the flow state either, and I'm sure it's easier to reach this flow state when you're going against, for jiu-jitsu, it's easier to get in the flow state when you're going against somebody who is not, the inputs aren't coming as fast as them. right? But I've had the most creative and the really out of body experiences competing at the highest level. I've had many opportunities where I've done a technique to submit and win a match, and I've never done it before. This particular variation, I've never done it before. But it again, from my study, I in doing that, my style would be, oh, I just did this move. I'm gonna go drill this technique. I'm gonna learn this move. Whereas I could see it easily being like, oh, I just did this move. I didn't even know what I was doing. This really boosts my ego, and let me just keep going. I think that is an obvious, easy track to go down, and it wouldn't even come up to me to explain that to people if I didn't kind of investigate technology. And I feel like, I have this intrinsic motivation, this kind of feel. I guess that you can tune into the feelings of, hey, I should be doing this or that, or I should work on this or that. And for sure, it's got to be some process and some side effect of what what you're doing, reading, writing, training, being, so I think maybe what could you or maybe articulate a little bit more? What is that in between the flow state?
Well, everything you said is magnificent. So a few things come to mind. What you were just saying about jiu-jitsu and how in a match you come up with something you never thought before. Well, they'll talk about dialogo, circling, philosophy. Like philosophy, suddenly you're in a conversation and ideas are coming you never thought before. You'll be writing a story and the story takes a direction you never thought, but then when it occurs, it's perfect. Again, another reason why art, philosophy, and gymnastics, I'm just using gymnastics to refer to this, they all have a characteristic of this ability of something arising that is totally new, but when it arises, it feels like it could have gone no other way, and it was only possible because the people were doing the thing. That's another reason why these three seem to somehow need one another, inform one another, and can overlap. The other thing before I forget, I want to note, it would be an entirely different conversation, but another reason why jiu-jitsu is probably like extremely useful for philosophical reasoning is because the metaphysical foundation of reality is probably more so situation than points and things, following Leibniz over Descartes. And if that is the case, then reality is not, reality is always constituted by a mutual informing of humans with situations. And therefore, the more you can learn to respond to your reality, like on a mat, the more you're actually learning to be more as a subject, living in a manner that better aligns with with how reality actually is. And that gets us into Leibniz and different things. And Anthony Morley has written an unbelievable book on that, on Leibniz and analysis of citas. But it's very important that a barrier that some people may have to understanding the relation between philosophy, gymnastics, and art is that they're still thinking according to something more algebraic, as Leibniz would say, kind of a point thing universe, when really there are only processes, situations, and unfolding in a Burks and Whitehead said. You bring that metaphysics in here, a lot of this makes a lot more sense. So I think that's very important. The other thing I'll say is that it's funny because there's this kind of default going through the motions, this roboticism that's bad. And then there's this thing where you work really hard so you can go to a state that's like the automatic, but it's not. And it's more like the flow state. Now, I put it before that you have the flow state is a very intense, concentrated sort of activity, but you want to be able that tends to come out in a concentrated situation, like on a mat, but you want to actually have something like the flow state define your entire daily life, which would be more like intrinsic motivation, where you're intrinsically motivated to go on. That's a form of the flow state. It's more diluted in a way, or it's more kind of spread out. You could also talk about self-forgetfulness that Timothy Keller talks about, which is the ability to forget yourself in your daily activity. You're not always thinking about your status or what other people think about you. You forget yourself. And for Timothy Keller, self-forgetfulness is a middle ground between like egotism, where you're always thinking about yourself, but then there's actually the self-degradation where you're always humiliating yourself and you're not training or anything because you're like, well, who am I to think I can train to be good on the mat? I'm just, this kind of false humility. And so there's a ditch on either side of the road. And so for Timothy Keller, there's like self-forgetfulness, where the self is something you use just like your thumb. If you spend all day looking at your thumb, you're dysfunctional. And if you cut your thumb off, you're dysfunctional, right? The key is to basically forget about it. Just use it. Well, so it goes with yourself. You want to be so in the flow, heart, mind, and body on your daily activity that you don't really think about yourself. You just use yourself, just like a thumb. So that's a kind of form of the flow state. Another term could be auto mastery, where you've worked so hard that you're able to just go through life, not in a thoughtless way. It seems thoughtless, but it's actually auto mastery that's a result of great conditioning, where you're able to go through the life. But actually, critically, the very fact that the kind of thoughtless, robotic way of life in a way looks similar to the auto mastery is a reason why you need philosophy. Because you cannot tell the difference necessarily just by looking at the person, right? You can't necessarily tell the person the difference between the person doing jiu-jitsu from a kind of like egotistical way and the person who's doing it from this deeper human way, right? Well, that's why you need philosophy. Because if you have two things that look the same, the only way to tell the difference is to be able to read the metaphysics, if you will, and that's what philosophy trains you in. And so you require it to tell that difference. You know, the other thing I was thinking about when you were saying about how like being able to self-defend in the mind, because as you get older, you can't do the self-defense with the body so much. That's absolutely the case. And basically, especially with AI coming, you're going to be manipulated. If you're not able to fight ideology in the TV and the politician and the expert class, you're in huge trouble. But what's so fascinating is at the same time that philosophical training lasts longer than, say, physical training, there's some weird thing where if earlier in life you don't go through physical training, your philosophy tends to be bad. So it is a two-way street, because I've also encountered like a lot of the artists or philosophers I know that have no physical training don't tend to be very good philosophically or artistically, because they don't have the whole picture. So even though it's true that when you're 50, you're not going to be the same jiu-jitsu fighter that you were at 20, you as a philosophical fighter at 50 will be greatly impoverished if you did not do jiu-jitsu as 20 or wrestling or something. Plato seems to say the same thing in book 7. That's why kids start with gymnastics, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's so fascinating in book 7, because the Republic needs to be read as pedagogy, like an educational book, especially book 7 of the Republic. And what always is fascinating is, one, he's like, don't force kids to learn until they're 10 because they'll hate learning. He's like, just let them play. That's pretty counterintuitive to what we do today. He's basically like, just let kids play. And then like playing gymnastics, there's three things. Well, I talked with this with Paul Chen quite a bit, and it's in Belonging again too. But there seems to be three things that you want to start kids with that apply to all human beings to make them love learning and set them on the right path. You start them off with wonder, where you make them go, wow, being is crazy, play, and physical training. And what do I mean by wonder? And we do this with our kids. Get them to look at a tree and say, hey, what's that? They say, a tree. And you say, how do you know it's a tree? Or what do you mean by tree? And they say, oh, I mean, it's a kind of plant growing. It's like, well, how do you tell the difference between the tree and the forest? And it's like, well, the tree has this look. Oh, are you saying the difference is geometrical? And you keep going and you go going. And if there's eventually a point where the penny drops, where they go, oh my gosh, even the most basic of phenomenon have this entire world and context and story that unfolds if you just ask the right questions. And suddenly they're kind of like amazed, right? Well, now you've got them interested in learning, because learning is not even learning. Learning is exploring, right? And then you make it play, and then you have physical training. But what's so fascinating is that Plato's almost suggesting that philosophy can't live, it can't take off without that physical training. And I think that's true, because I just in my own personal experience have seen where philosophers older in life, because they didn't have physical experience earlier, it actually does impact their philosophy in negative ways. The same goes with creative writers, fiction writers. This is, of course, not a hard and fast rule. But there is something about the lack of the tactile experience, as Fournier would put it, that trickles down. And so yes, later in life, philosophical self-defense will be more important than physical self-defense, but the quality of your philosophical self-defense later in life will be strongly connected to if you had physical training in self-defense early on, if you will, because that's going to change the quality of your thought. And so they go together. There is a kind of ordering. There is a kind of one lasts longer than the other, but ultimately, following Plato, you got to have both. And I think you said, well, actually, honestly, what happens to philosophers, in my experience, who don't have any physical training, is they're not situational or discerning. They tend to find kind of universal principles, and then they think everyone should think that way, or they're stupid. And you get what Thomas Sowell calls kind of the intellectual class. You get what Julian Benda puts at, and I talked with Joshua Hansen about this, and it was a lot of fun. You get this intellectual class that thinks they can run the world and knows better than anyone else, and they tend to be very controlling. And that's what unfortunately tends to occur with intellect. It's almost like if intellectuals do not earlier in life has any physical training, there's still that thymos, that they need. And they take it out on becoming totalitarian later on and controlling. It's like if you don't do, I guess it's logos, eros, and thymos in the classical conception, right? If you don't get all three of those in your life, then it's going to come out in a kind of pathological or dangerous way later on. And what seems to occur for the intellectual who doesn't get the thymos early on is it comes out in a certain systems building, a certain, I understand the truth of reality, and you get the bad guru, you get the cult leader, you get the intellectual professor who manipulates people. So although it's true that philosophical training, and I'll give it back to you, although it's true philosophical self-defense is going to stay with you, it's probably going to rot and become a source of manipulation over others if you don't have the physical training at some point of your life, so you get that thymos. I'd be curious what you think of that.
Yeah, it just seems like you need the concrete, the you need to run into your arguments, need to run into your thoughts, right? And I think jiu-jitsu, is a really cool sandbox to just throw yourself right in there and get straight to yourself. And I really just hadn't. It's hard for me. I'm just now I've noticed this, and it's been hard for me to deal with. But as like reading the Republic and having some obscure view on it and not reading it as how you should educate yourself. It seemed obvious to me. It seemed it's speaking to me in an easy way, and I think. That I think you almost have to be conditioned to see the Republic in another way, and jiu-jitsu is kind of that tactile, remembering similar scenario where you're going to be, I think, even more than reading, because you again, it's more primal, it's more instant, it's more, the feedback is right there. It's the timing of thinking and feeling. It's kind of cool simultaneous thing. And I think jiu-jitsu is what's really special to it, that there's always something that somebody gets and something different, and everybody's at a different point in time. And as being a professor, what's cool, jiu-jitsu, you have to teach. It has to be disclosed and shared. And the style of gym that I have, the dojo that we have here, is I take the role of a guide instead of the head professor who knows everything, and it helps to, and I want my students to be explorers, but there's danger in exploration, especially injury in jiu-jitsu. There's danger of, getting locked into one type of technique. One popular is the leg locks. You could get fully assumed in a leg locks. And one of the funny there was a group of competitors who really kind of changed the environment, especially of the no gi grappling without the uniform, that they really used the leg locks to exploit the whole culture, really. But now we're at a point where everybody understands the leg lock game, and it's not going to be as effective as it once was. You could be stuck in that same mode and being not as effective, even though you were at the peak of specialization and winning. And now it's not helping you anymore. And you could dig in deeper and try, and you could investigate and measure it more and get more data and optimize it, but it's still not going to be able to compete with something that obvious yet hidden that you're giving to your opponent, right? Like that you have it fixed in your game. So I think it's really it's a really goes hand in hand with philosophy in that sense.
Well, I'll just note, like, that ability to think situationally, for me, a very practical example of the consequences of that is say in economics, where, say, Keynesian economics that's able to stimulate the market, one would say you build a highway. The reason why that probably works, actually, is because everyone, even, you don't need any sort of intellectual level or expertise to go out and say highway. Oh, I can drive car. That adds value. Okay, so it's very given. Here's the problem. As technology advances, not everyone agrees so readily on what adds value than not. And so if you're still following a Keynesian paradigm of, say, now, it's an entirely different discussion, but there's a difference between a money multiplier and an investment multiplier. And the kind of idea is that investment seems to stimulate the economy so long as it's not ambiguous if it's an investment or not, that it's just kind of everyone can agree in the community that's an investment, therefore they're motivated to be more productive, therefore the economy gets stronger. But if there's a supposed investment and half the town feels like it's a waste of money and doesn't understand it, but the other town does, the amount of productivity that comes out of it is less, right? Well, we're at an age now where what constitutes an investment is an extremely complex computer or chip or whatever, and the majority of people don't understand it. So that way of stimulating your economy is not as effective as it once was, but you have intellectuals who are in the old paradigm who are just bent to believe that it once worked. Look, the models show it used to work. It has to still work. And they're now creating inflation. Because when you spend money that doesn't turn into investment, you inflate the currency, right? So that's an example of the inability to adjust with the changing of the times is really, really problematic. The reason why it might be particularly problematic with intellectuals, I love your phrase, run against the argument, is intellectuals do not so easily have to run against their arguments. Thomas Sowell is really good on this, because they basically can hang out with other intellectuals that agree with them. And if the test of the ideas in the classroom is what the professor grades, then the professor controls the thing they run up against, right? So they never have to kind of run up against it. It becomes a closed system. And, you mentioned business. Business is another way where you run up against your argument. You thought this was a good product? Nobody wants it. You run against the truth. And basically, philosophy is in huge trouble when it removes mechanisms of running into anything. And that's what you can learn from business and gymnastics. And the other problem is the intellectual who never runs up against their arguments tends to be arrogant. They never develop the humility, and frankly, they never develop situational thinking. And what they end up doing is, instead of making their theories fit with the world, they make the world fit with their theories. Well, now we have totalitarianism of the 20th century. And basically, the whole modern counter-enlightenment was like, hey, that's what intellectualism tends to do if it never has to run up against its arguments, if it doesn't have common life, as David Hume will talk about, and so on and so forth. So I think that running up against thing is really important. I think philosophers, the intellectual work, although it may be longer lasting in your life, when you're 60, you still need it, it's more prone to self-enclosure than physical activity. That's kind of the trade-off. Physical activity is not so prone to this kind of arrogant closing off because you have to go on the mat, inevitably, unless you're just lifting weights. But the trade-off is by the time you're 40, you don't use it as much, right? Philosophy, you're going to use it your whole life, but the risk is it's more able to avoid tests. And so it's more prone to rot in that sort of enclosure structure. So all of them have pluses and minuses. And unfortunately, the educational system almost moralizes an intellectual life that never has to test itself as being more objective or more dispassionate and whatever. And it's a massive mistake that I think has led to philosophy basically dying in many, many areas. And it's really too bad. The last thing I'll say, and then give it back to you, is that I think what you're talking about as well, you're talking about kind of like awareness. When you go on the mat, you gain a new kind of awareness. And McGilchrist, he makes the example, when you look at a cross, like a Christian cross, it's made of atoms, it has a certain chemical composition, and it's a symbol. Okay, which of those is the most real? The atoms, the chemical, or the symbol? McGilchrist says all three are equally real, and that you have to choose your mode of awareness by which you approach the cross, right? Well, guess what? That means there's a choice of awareness you need to make before you begin thinking. And if you're not aware that what you think is relative to the mode of awareness you have, you may bracket out the other ways of understanding the cross and not even realize you're doing it. That's the problem of reductionism, right? If you say, well, the atoms are most real, well, then you bracket out the other modes of awareness. What jiu-jitsu and gymnastics can do is make you aware that, oh, you thought that you just needed those leg moves to win? Well, now you're aware that that doesn't work so much. And your mode of training changes, right? What's rational to do in training changes, right? Because you're aware to something, aware to a different alternative. The problem that happens with philosophy is because it can avoid tests, it never has to realize there are other modes of awareness by which to understand things. And so it kind of falls into a Gurdjieffian sleep almost, where it stays in its one mode of awareness and continues to optimize to that mode forever, and never even notices it lost the ability to see the rainbow, to see the full human being, to actually meet people in their common life. And so Plato seems to be been very aware of that. Therefore, the situational encounter of different interlocutors, the gymnastics, and so on and so forth. So that choice of the mode of awareness must never be forgotten. And there's something about gymnastics that can keep you remembering that choice of awareness.
Yeah, no, I think that yeah really applies for jujitsu so much, and I think really it even even if you succeed in business, even if you succeed in jujitsu, there's a lot of examples that it is not the success that you thought it was going to be. I mean, there's world champion jujitsu fighters who talk about feeling depression when they win the biggest title they've been reaching for. I personally, I mean, I noticed it instantly. That I noticed from a very beginning, I don't want to market my gym in such a way, my academy in such a way where I don't want to go there anymore. If you market for a type of, couch potato who you're going to just feed and exploit and do all the things that a smart business person would do, and make sure you don't leave any money on the table and really get everything out of there's not a place, an environment that I would want to be in, or I would want to teach in, or I'd want to run in, or it would be a very, I mean, I could, that seems obvious, but I'm sure there's many multiple examples of that. So I think the necessity of philosophy and the necessity of self-defense in all of its senses is, and the necessity of self-awareness. I think you really hit it on the head with those three different categories. They do need to be together, and I think great literature is important too. And I think though, in getting into those flow states and all of those different mediums is really important too. And I mean, um, yeah, I think like reading groups and all that is really really important. That's something that I want to be working on. To have there's just so again the tasks add up and the demand and what I'm the best at. I want to be be able to provide for, and like I want to learn from the people who are doing it um, in the real life right now. It's really cool to see your work, and you can see the um, what you're doing by everything that you put out. You have it's impressive, and it helps push. I'm sure a lot of people to keep on the path of what they're intrinsically motivated to do, and putting out good work and quality work, and having a sticking to the process, putting your 20 years 30 years. Even with jiu-jitsu, I've trained for 20 years, and I'd like to put 20 more good quality years in, and there's no way I can do it if I'm just going to try to go be the world champion and not think about anything else. You have to set yourself up to not just for physically to meet the demands, but also, like I want to have a well. I mean, I enjoy the way how much I enjoy jujitsu is undescribable, and I can express myself better than anything while I'm on the mat. I've actually even the when Zoom came around, I struggled with expressing myself through in a McLuhan sense through an electric medium. Whereas if we're in the same room together, it's going to be a much different, and I'm going to be in a different mode and teaching jiu-jitsu. Putting your hands on and really just being relaxed when people are being uncomfortable is probably one of the best skills as an instructor that I think that I do well is, and that's where, you know, I can really express myself. And that's where I think really where my where I've been putting my energy. But yeah, I think it's really important, and I really appreciate you having me on here. And
I've
the
enjoyed
work
it.
that you do is great.
Well, you are a gentleman, and alas, I've in about 10 minutes I'll have to go and blow the leaves out of because we have a rainstorm going, so I had to clean my gutters. But I've really enjoyed this. A few things just come to mind. One of the other, so if we move from algebra to geometry, points to situation, we start to see why philosophy and gymnastics can go together. Another move that can help is if we stop thinking philosophy is in the business of certainty. Philosophy is in the business of confidence. We can't be certain of anything, but that doesn't matter because we can be confident in a lot. And you see, that's really screwed up philosophy, is this quest of how can we be certain of anything? You don't have to be certain to be confident. I don't know for certain that the sun's going to come up tomorrow, but I can be really confident the sun is going to come up tomorrow. And if philosophy is in the business of cultivating confidence, well, that sounds like gymnastics, doesn't it? Cultivating confidence, cultivating this kind of confidence. And confidence, and the thing is then, if it's about confidence, then it's also about self-defense in that confidence. And then stuff like in your book, like I was saying, well, you're talking about like grip and like I think go behind, tipping, like these different techniques.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is what you gain confidence in knowing how to do, right? Well, suddenly all of the skills of philosophy are about things you have confidence to employ so you can maintain wonder in life, so that you can maintain self-defense. And so philosophy is confidence and situation helps us align it with the gymnastic conception as well. And the last thing I'll say, and then give it back to you for closing remarks, and I really have enjoyed this, Drew, so thank you so much, and thank you for your kind words and support over our work over all the years, and for the amazing work you do at your business, because it is very difficult to run a business, and it is very difficult to kind of create a space that is simply not a space, but a place of dwelling. And that requires a certain cultivation of an environment where people want to stay for so many hours afterwards. But the last thing I'll say is you were mentioning how you can become a world champion and then be depressed. You can get what you want in life and you're unhappy. So as you know, in psychoanalysis, there's the notion of lack, the con, all of that different stuff where you get the object of desire and it turns out that it's not what you wanted and so on. And a lot of people take this, it's kind of depressing, right? Well, actually, lack is a revelation that the point of life is to condition yourself for a process, to find joy in the process, not in the object. Philosophy then is conditioning yourself for that reality because it's very counterintuitive. It's very counterintuitive to think that you should do something to have a something that you find life in as opposed to reach a destination where the journey is the road. Like there's that Wendell Berry poem where he says something like what he says, in life is to be the place where you come upon a road and stop and make it a home, where you turn the road into a home, basically. And there's something about where human beings are best when you come to enjoy the process and to live in the process. And lack is precisely the opening that makes it possible for the human to condition themselves for an infinite process. Because here's the thing. If human subjectivity is constituted by a lack, then that means there's always something to do. The lack can be an opening for an infinite process because you simply process yourself in that lack, knowing that no object will bring you final fulfillment. So your job is to find fulfillment in the conditioning in the project, right? And that sounds kind of lame until you understand that the best friends tend to be people who share in a mutual process. Like, who are you best friends with? the people who are also finding enjoyment in the process itself, the people who are also processing. This sort of mode of the individual subject is precisely the condition of the individual subject that makes possible the best community, and the community is the goal. Not an object, but a communal situation that brings together different people of different qualities that are able to come together in a certain harmony because they all enjoy the process of itself. And that's also why, like, jiu-jitsu needs philosophy, because otherwise it's going to become about the object and the goal, not about the process that creates the special condition of friendship. So lack, the Lacanian lack, is what you then philosophically condition yourself to know that the goal of life is not objects, but a condition and atmosphere and dwelling, if you will, possible with other people who also forego the object for the process that then makes possible the dance, the Dante-esque sort of movement forever. All of this can be found in the bringing together of, say, gymnastics with the arts with philosophy. And that's really what life seems to be so much about, is that mutual dwelling in processes that are their own end, that then make us the kind of subjects who can have a unique quality of friendship and community that otherwise cannot be known. And that, I think that's a lot of what life is about. So I appreciate the work you're doing.
Thanks, Daniel. Really thanks for having me. And yeah, I just think I think it's pretty obvious there's not that many places like that offer this, and some of the places that you hang out online, and some of the places online I think can fill that. But there's even less places where you can do that in the real, where you have to face the other and you're embodied and not disembodied. And it just makes it more intense and more potent, I believe. But and I'm curious to see how jiu-jitsu is still a growing sport, still a growing art, and which could still be captured by many other things too. So I think it's really important for jiu-jitsu instructors and owners and professors and students to really get with philosophy and really take it seriously, the self-awareness, self-examination, and just and really kind of similarly cultivate a love for wisdom, an enjoyment, and an intrinsic motivation. It's not really hard to logically show that, hey, this is going to give you the most happiness or the most fulfillment. It's not a rational. You could explain rationally why it would be important for people to do, but really to tap into that intrinsic motivation of the love of wisdom, or the loving what's necessary, we could really, I think, really needs to be told to the jiu-jitsu community.
Well, I think what needs to be told to the philosophy community is the name for the gymnastics. So there's, so it all comes together. I appreciate everything you said. And we will be sure I have to say, your Instagram photography media game is amazing. So we'll have links to all of the different things where people can see the work that you do. And and like you said, I don't think these kind of, Heidegger talks about dwelling, Ivan Illich talks about dwelling, this kind of notion of dwelling is widespread. It's extremely necessary. And look, I think there are ways to figure out how to make the online and the real interact to help create this dwelling, but it won't be found in one or the other necessarily. Like, I think the internet can help people find one another who otherwise could not, that may be able to mutually inform one another to change how they act in the actual, that then bring them together. But there's this interesting experimentation to figure out how they can inform one another. And I think you are seeing this new quality of philosophy, gymnastics, art, community that's coming out, that we're in the middle of and that we're working through. And it's a pleasure to be in the space with you. So Drew, thank you for everything you do. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, sir.
You got it. Thanks a lot.
All the best, Drew. Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
Too.
Appreciate it.